The wind has a voice in this high, lonely country. It speaks in a low moan across the cracked earth of Jedediah Stone's ranch, a language of grit and desolation. Today, it whispers a warning he doesn't yet understand. Jed stands on his porch, a silhouette of lean muscle and quiet endurance against the vast, bruised sky. His world is this: the rickety porch, the dust-choked yard, the weathered barn leaning like a tired old man, and the endless expanse of sagebrush that bleeds into the jagged teeth of the distant mountains. He is a man who has made a covenant with solitude, and so far, solitude has kept its end of the bargain. But today, something is different. Three somethings. Out by the dry creek bed that marks the edge of his property, three small figures shimmer in the heat haze. They are not animals. They are not riders. They are children, small and still as desert quail, their dark hair a stark slash against the pale earth. He squints, the lines around his eyes deepening. Apache. He can tell by the cut of their worn buckskin, by the way they hold themselves, a stillness born of fear and necessity. They are alone, impossibly alone in this unforgiving wilderness. He watches them for a long time, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Every instinct, honed by years of hardship and the grim tales that drifted out of town, screams at him to go inside, bar the door, and let the desert reclaim what it will. But then the smallest of the three stumbles, and the oldest, a boy no more than 10, catches him, holding him up with a strength that seems too great for his slender frame. In that small, desperate gesture, Jed sees something other than a threat. He sees an echo. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts. A long-buried memory flickers, a small hand in his, a feverish brow, a silence in the cabin that became permanent. He swallows, the sound harsh in his own ears. The choice is a simple, brutal one. Ignore them and let them perish, or intervene and invite a world of trouble he cannot possibly imagine. For a moment that stretches into an eternity, the loner in him battles the man he once was. Then, with a sigh that seems to drain the last of his resistance, he turns back into the cabin. When he reemerges, he is not carrying the rifle. He is carrying a dented pot of beans and 3 wooden bowls. And with that simple act, a choice to share what little he has, his life, the silence of his land, and the very definition of his world are about to be irrevocably changed. The sun had been a merciless hammer all day, beating the land into submission. Jedediah Stone's ranch was less a home and more a stubborn refusal to die, etched into a landscape that offered little and demanded everything. The cabin, built of cottonwood logs he'd hauled 10 miles from the river, was tight and dark. It smelled of pine pitch, old smoke, and the lingering scent of the loneliness he'd worn like a second skin for 6 years. His life was a litany of routines. He rose before the sun painted the eastern mountains in hues of blood and rose. His first chore to check the well. The well was his lifeblood, a deep, cold promise in the heart of a thirsty land. It was the reason he'd bought this patch of desolation, and the reason he was still here. After the well, he'd tend his few cattle, their ribs showing like washboards no matter how much they grazed on the sparse, tough grass. He'd mend the same fences, patch the same roof, and cook the same meager meals. He had come here to forget. He had come here to let the silence scour him clean of the memories of a wife's laughter and a son's small voice, both stolen by the fever that had swept through their homestead back in Kansas. He'd buried them, sold the farm for a pittance, and walked west until the world felt big enough to contain his grief. He'd found this place, 100 miles from the nearest real town, with only the dusty outpost of Purgatory Gulch a half-day's ride away. It was a place where no one knew his name or the ghosts that walked beside him. He was just Stone, the quiet rancher who kept to himself. The solitude he'd sought had become his jailer and his only friend. So when he saw the 3 Apache children huddled by the skeletal remains of a cottonwood near his creek bed, it felt like a violation. They were a piece of the dangerous, complicated world he had deliberately fled. His first thought was of their parents. A war party? Hunters? His hand had gone to his rifle out of pure, ingrained reflex. This was Apache territory, or had been. The treaties were ink on paper. The memories were blood in the soil. White men and Apaches met in violence more often than in peace. But as he watched them, the hardness in him began to crack. They weren't scouts. They were children, orphans by the look of it. Their clothes were tattered, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. They watched his cabin with the wariness of hunted animals. They made no fire, no sound. The oldest boy stood sentinel while the other two, a girl and a much younger boy, sat with their backs against the dead tree, their small bodies slumped with exhaustion. The internal war raged within him. He was one man. What could he do? Bringing them in was a risk. What if their people were nearby and saw it as a kidnapping? What if they weren't, and he was suddenly responsible for 3 mouths he could barely feed alongside his own? He thought of the folk in Purgatory Gulch. They spoke of the Apache with a mixture of fear and loathing, fueled by stories of raids and massacres. Bringing Apache children into that world would be like throwing lambs to wolves. He paced the confines of his small cabin, the floorboards groaning under his worn boots. He tried to ignore them. He went about his evening chores, his movements stiff and angry. He fed his horse, filled the water trough, and chopped wood for the stove. But with every swing of the axe, he saw their small, still forms. He saw the fierce, protective stance of the older boy. He saw the way the little girl's head drooped onto her brother's shoulder. Finally, he could bear it no longer. It was not a grand moral decision. It was a simple, gut-level response to the sight of suffering. He looked at the pot of beans simmering on his stove, his dinner and breakfast for the next day. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had. He ladled the thick, smoky stew into 3 of the 4 wooden bowls he owned. The 4th one, his son's, he never used. He left his rifle and his pistol belt inside. He walked out onto the porch and into the fading light, the bowls heavy in his hands, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than he had in years. He stopped a good 50 yards from them, not wanting to spook them. He set the bowls on the ground, then backed away slowly, his hands held open and away from his body. "For you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. The oldest boy's eyes, dark and intelligent, narrowed. He pushed his siblings further behind him. He didn't move. Jed waited. The sun bled out behind the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the land. The air grew cooler. The scent of the beans, rich with salt pork and chili, drifted on the breeze. It was the youngest child who broke the standoff. A small whimper escaped his lips. The girl looked from the bowls to her brother, her expression a silent, desperate plea. For a long minute, the oldest boy remained defiant, his pride a fragile shield against starvation. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He gave Jed one last, suspicious look before slowly, cautiously, leading the other 2 toward the food. They ate like starving wolves, scooping the beans into their mouths with their hands, not stopping until the bowls were scraped clean. Jed watched from his porch, a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with his own hunger. When they were finished, the oldest boy stacked the bowls neatly and placed them where Jed had left them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Jed's direction, not of thanks, but of acknowledgement. An exchange had been made. Then he led his siblings back to the shelter of the dead tree. Jed retrieved the bowls and went inside, the brief encounter leaving him strangely shaken. He barred the door, a habit he hadn't broken, and sat in the dark. He had done a good thing, a foolish thing, a dangerous thing. He didn't know which. He expected to lie awake all night, listening for the sound of approaching riders, for the cry of vengeance. But exhaustion claimed him, and he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He awoke to a profound silence. Not his usual silence, the one filled with the familiar drone of insects and the sigh of the wind. This was a heavy, watchful quiet. Something was wrong. He grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs, and moved to the small window beside the door. He peered through a crack in the shutter. His empty field, the one that stretched out from his yard to the creek bed, was no longer empty. In the pearlescent light of dawn, A village had sprouted from the barren earth. Dozens of tepees, their tanned hides glowing softly, stood in a wide, silent circle. Thin tendrils of smoke rose from their peaks, mingling with the morning mist. Horses, more than he could count, grazed quietly. Figures moved among the dwellings, their movements fluid and purposeful. The children were gone from the dead tree. They had been absorbed back into their world. And his world, the small, solitary fortress he had built around his heart, had just been surrounded. His act of kindness had not gone unnoticed. It had been a signal, a beacon, and the night had brought an answer he could never have predicted. His empty field had sprouted tepees, and Jedediah Stone was no longer alone. The fear was a cold knot in his belly. He was one man with a rifle and a handful of cartridges against an entire Apache band. His mind raced. This had to be their people. The children had somehow led them here, or they had been tracking them. The beans. Had they seen the beans as a tribute? A trick? He cursed his own soft-hearted foolishness. He should have left them be. The desert had its own cruel logic, and he had interfered with it. He stayed by the window for what felt like hours, watching as the sun climbed higher, burning the mist off the land. The camp came to life, but it was a quiet life. Women moved about their tasks, their long skirts brushing the dust. Men tended to the horses, their lean, powerful forms moving with an unnerving grace. He saw no overt threat, no war paint, no brandished weapons. But their presence was a weapon in itself. It was a claim. His small ranch was an island in their sea. He knew he couldn't hide forever. His cattle needed water. He needed water. To stay inside was to die of thirst. To go outside was what? To die quickly? He took a deep breath, the air stale and thick with his own fear. He had faced down blizzards, droughts, and the crushing weight of his own grief. He would not be undone by fear of the unknown. He unbarred the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, the weight a small comfort, and stepped out onto the porch. Every eye in the encampment turned to him. 100 dark, unreadable gazes fixed on him, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The quiet activity ceased. There was only the wind, whispering through the sagebrush, and the thumping of his own blood in his ears. A small group of men detached themselves from the main gathering and began to walk toward his cabin. They were led by a man who was neither old nor young, his face a mask of hard-won authority. He was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a lance, not as a threat, but as a badge of office. Beside him walked an old woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her eyes holding a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. And between them, holding their hands, were the 3 children. They stopped about 20 yards from his porch, the same distance he had kept from them the night before. The warrior's face was impossible to read, a stoic sculpture of suspicion. But the old woman's eyes were different. They were searching, questioning. Jed's gaze flickered to the children. The little girl gave him a shy, tentative smile. The youngest boy ducked behind the woman's skirt. But the oldest boy, the one who had been so fierce and defiant, looked directly at Jed. He stepped forward slightly and said something in his own tongue, his voice clear and strong. He pointed first at Jed, then at the empty bowls that Jed had left on the porch rail. The old woman listened, her gaze never leaving Jed's face. When the boy was finished, she spoke, her voice surprisingly strong, though the words were in her own language. The warrior, Kale, remained silent, his hand resting lightly on the handle of a knife at his belt. He was a coiled spring, ready to react to the slightest hint of aggression. Jed knew this was the fulcrum on which his life now balanced. He had to respond, but how? He knew only a few words of Apache, learned from traders and trappers, mostly curses and commands. None of them would serve him now. He thought of running, of making a break for the barn and his horse, but he knew he wouldn't make it 50 feet. He thought of raising his rifle, but that would be suicide. So he did the only thing he could. He stood his ground. He met the warrior's hard gaze without flinching, and then he looked at the old woman. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, an acknowledgement, man to man, human to human. He then unslung his rifle from his shoulder. He didn't drop it, for that would be a gesture of submission he wasn't willing to make. Instead, he held it across his body, barrel pointed safely at the ground, and leaned it against the porch post beside him. It was a gesture of trust, a fragile, terrifying offering. He then pointed to the well, its wooden housing weathered and gray. He made a motion of drinking, then gestured out towards their camp, an open invitation. Water was life. It was the only currency that mattered out here. It was the only language they both understood perfectly. The old woman, Cully, watched him, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in her ancient eyes. She murmured something to the warrior, Kale. He grunted a reply, his suspicion warring with the undeniable logic of Jed's offer. Water was a truce. To deny a man water was an act of war. To offer it was an act of peace. After a tense moment that stretched thin as a spider's thread, Kale gave a curt nod. Cully smiled, a genuine, gentle curving of her lips that transformed her wrinkled face. She said a single word, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Dagote. It was a word Jed did not know, but he understood the tone. It was not a threat. This was the beginning. Not a friendship, not yet, but of a cautious, unspoken negotiation. He was a loner who had shared his beans, and in return, the world had come to his doorstep. His first test was not a battle of bullets and blades, but a silent offering of water and a leaning rifle. And for now, in the bright, unforgiving light of morning, it was enough. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. The Apache camp, the people of the Blue Water, as he would come to learn they called themselves, remained. They were a self-contained universe, operating on principles Jed could only guess at. They were led by Cully, the clan's grandmother, whose authority was absolute and unquestioned. Her son, Kale, was their war chief, the protector, and the three children, Taza, the defiant older boy, Nalin, the watchful girl, and little Denali, the shy one, were her grandchildren. Their parents had been lost to a sickness that had swept through their winter camp, forcing the survivors to move on, seeking safer ground. They had been tracking the children for a week, guided by signs only they could read, and had arrived the night after Jed's act of kindness. Jed and the Apache existed in a state of cautious proximity. He went about his chores, always aware of the eyes on him. They went about their lives, their quiet dignity, a constant presence at the edge of his vision. There was no formal agreement, only the truce he had offered with the water from his well. Each morning, a line of women would come with clay pots and water skins, and Jed would work the winch, hauling up bucket after bucket of cold, clear water. They never spoke to him, offering only silent nods of gratitude, but it was a ritual that bound them together. The children were the bridge. At first, they watched him from a distance, small shadows flitting at the edge of the camp. Then, one afternoon, as Jed was struggling to reset a fence post, Taza appeared at his side. The boy said nothing, but picked up the tamping rod and began to pack the earth around the post with an efficiency that bespoke long practice. Jed grunted his surprise, and they worked in silence, side by side, until the post was firm. When they were done, Taza simply nodded and walked away. The next day, Nalin left a small bundle on his porch rail. Inside were wild onions and a handful of potent, fragrant herbs. Jed, who had been eating nothing but salted beef and beans for months, cooked them with his supper that night. The flavor was a revelation, a taste of the living earth he had forgotten existed. He saved one of the onions and, the following morning, left it by the well for her. He saw her pick it up, a quick, secretive smile gracing her face before she scurried away. Little Denali was the hardest to win over. He remained velcroed to Cully's side. But Jed had a secret weapon. In a dusty chest at the foot of his bed lay the few things he had kept of his sons. Among them was a small wooden horse, crudely carved but smoothed by a child's loving hands. One evening, his heart aching with a bittersweet pain, he took it out. He sat on his porch steps, turning the toy over and over in his calloused fingers. Denali watched him from the entrance to Cully's tepee, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. Slowly, Jed placed the horse on the lowest step. He gave it a small nudge, so it rocked back and forth. Then he stood up, went inside, and closed his door, watching through the crack. It took a long time. Finally, the boy's curiosity overcame his fear. He crept forward, a tiny scout on a vital mission, snatched the horse, and darted back to the safety of the teepee. Jed felt a pang of loss, followed by a strange, warm feeling he couldn't name. He had given away the last piece of his son, and in doing so, had made a new connection. His relationship with Cale remained the most fraught. The warrior watched him with an unblinking intensity. Cale was a man forged in conflict, responsible for the safety of his people. He saw Jed not as an individual, but as a representative of the white men who had taken their lands, broken their treaties, and spread disease. He saw the rifle, the cabin, the fences as symbols of an encroaching world that meant destruction for his own. One afternoon, Cale approached Jed as he was sharpening his axe. The warrior didn't speak, but stood silently, his presence a palpable weight. Jed's muscles tensed, but he continued his work, drawing the file over the steel in long, steady strokes. Finally, Cale pointed to the axe, then to a fallen log. He made a gesture of splitting wood. It was a challenge, cloaked as a simple question. Jed nodded. He took the log, stood it on its end, and with a single, powerful swing, split it cleanly in two. He was a strong man, made tough by years of labor. He looked at Cale, a hint of pride in his eyes. Cale was unimpressed. He took the axe from Jed. His grip was different, lighter. He didn't use brute force. He sighted down the grain of the wood, his body moving with a fluid economy of motion. His swing was faster, more precise, and the wood seemed to fall apart with half the effort. He split the other half of the log, then handed the axe back to Jed and walked away without a word. It was a lesson, not an insult. Cale had shown him a better way, a smarter way. It was a small crack in the wall of his suspicion, a demonstration of superiority that was also, paradoxically, an offering of knowledge. Jed understood. Out here, efficiency was survival. Cale had shown him how to survive a little better. The first real test of their fragile coexistence came not from within, but from the outside world. A rider appeared on the horizon, trailing a plume of dust. It was Tom Calloway, a rancher whose spread was a half-day's ride to the east. Calloway was a gossip, a man whose infrequent visits Jed tolerated for the sake of news for Purgatory Gulch. As Calloway drew closer, his easygoing expression soured. He reined in his horse, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear as he took in the sight of the Apache camp spread across Jed's field. "Stone, what in God's name is this?" he yelled, his hand drifting instinctively to the pistol on his hip. "Are you a prisoner here?" Before Jed could answer, the camp fell silent. Warriors, Cale among them, seemed to materialize from the earth, their expressions hard and dangerous. Jed held up a hand, a calming gesture aimed at both Calloway and the Apaches. "They're my guests, Tom," he said, his voice level. Calloway stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "Guests? Jed, have you gone mad? These are hostiles. You'll have the whole territory down on you. Silas Croft will hear of this before sundown." The name hung in the air like a vulture. Silas Croft was the unofficial king of Purgatory Gulch, a wealthy, ruthless land speculator who owned the bank, the saloon, and most of the town council. Croft had made no secret of his desire for Jed's land, coveting the deep, reliable well. He had made offers, all of which Jed had refused. Croft was not a man who took no for an answer. "That's my business," Jed said, his voice harder now. "They needed water. I gave it. There's been no trouble." "No trouble yet," Calloway spat, his fear turning to righteous anger. "You're harboring savages, Stone. You're putting us all at risk. Croft will have a sheriff out here to burn them out, and you with them if you're not careful." He didn't wait for a reply. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, as if fleeing a plague. Jed watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his gut. Calloway wasn't just a messenger. He was a spark, and Silas Croft was a barrel of gunpowder. The quiet world he had shared with the Apache was about to be shattered. He turned and looked at the camp. Cale was watching him, his expression grim. The unspoken truce was over. The outside world had found them, and it was coming to destroy their fragile peace. The uneasy peace shattered the moment Tom Calloway's dust settled. A palpable tension descended over the ranch and the camp, a heavy blanket of shared dread. The children no longer played near Jed's cabin. They stayed within the protective circle of the tepees. The women who came for water moved with a hurried, furtive air, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Cale and his warriors were a constant, visible presence, their patrols extending further, their faces set in grim lines. Jed felt the change in his own bones. The solitude he had once cherished now felt like a terrifying vulnerability. He was one man, caught between a world that despised him and a people who barely trusted him. Calloway's words echoed in his mind. Croft will have the sheriff out here to burn them out. Silas Croft was not a man of idle threats. He was a predator who used fear and the law as his weapons. The Apaches on Jed's land were not a problem for Croft. They were an opportunity, an excuse to seize the one thing he coveted, the well. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, Cully appeared at his cabin door. It was the first time she had come to him directly. Nalin was with her, clutching the old woman's hand, the wooden horse tucked into her sash. Jed invited them in with a gesture. His cabin seemed small and crude compared to the elegant simplicity of their teepees. Cully's eyes took everything in, the sparse furniture, the clean-swept floor, the empty chair by the hearth that seemed to hold a permanent shadow. She spoke, and Nalin, who had picked up a surprising amount of English from listening to Jed mutter to himself and his horse, haltingly translated. "Grandmother," she says, "the man on the horse. He brings trouble," Nalin said, her small voice serious. "I know," Jed replied, looking at Cully. "His name is Calloway. He will tell another man, a powerful man named Croft. Croft wants this land. He will use you as his excuse to take it." Cully listened to the translation, her gaze unwavering. She responded in her own tongue, her voice calm and measured. Nalin struggled for the words. She says, "We are not your fight. The people have known men like this Croft. We can disappear. Go into the mountains. You'll be safe." Jed stared at her. They were offering him an escape. They would leave, face the dangers of the wilderness again, just to spare him the trouble they had inadvertently brought. A month ago, he would have taken the offer without a second thought, relieved to have his lonely silence back. But something had shifted inside him. He thought of Tazo working beside him at the fence, of the taste of Nalin's wild onions, of the look on Denali's face when he'd snatched the wooden horse. He thought of Cale's silent lesson with the axe. They were not just Apaches anymore. They were Cully, Cale, Taza, Nalin, Denali. They were a people who had shown him quiet dignity and a resilience that shamed his own self-pity. To let them leave now, to send them back into the harsh wilderness because he was afraid of a bully like Croft, felt like a betrayal. Not just of them, but of the man he was slowly, painfully becoming again. "No," he said, the word coming out with more force than he intended. Nalin translated, her eyes wide. Cully's expression didn't change, but a new light entered her eyes. Jed looked directly at the old woman. "This is my land," he said slowly, deliberately, so Nalin could keep up. "You're my guests. You needed water. I gave it. The trouble is with Croft, not with you. We will face him here, together." The word hung in the small cabin. Together. It was a word he hadn't used in 6 years. It felt foreign and powerful on his tongue. A long silence followed. Cully studied his face, her gaze seeming to penetrate to the core of him, weighing his resolve, his fear, his integrity. Finally, she gave a slow, deep nod. She had seen what she needed to see. The alliance, unspoken until now, was sealed. The very next day, the nature of their relationship changed. It was no longer two separate camps coexisting. It became one camp preparing for a siege. Cale came to him, not with suspicion, but with the grim purpose of a fellow commander. Through a series of gestures, sketches in the dirt, and the few words they shared, they planned their defense. Jed knew Croft. He would come with the law on his side, or what passed for it in Purgatory Gulch. Sheriff Brady was a weak man who did Croft's bidding. They would arrive with warrants and righteous fury, painting Jed as a traitor and the Apache as invaders. Cale understood the tactics of warfare. He showed Jed the best places to post lookouts, high on the rocky bluffs that overlooked the ranch. He demonstrated how the natural contours of the land, the dry creek bed and the thickets of mesquite, could be used as defensive positions. Jed, in turn, showed Cale the vulnerabilities of his cabin and barn, the blind spots where men could approach unseen. He brought out his spare rifle, an old but reliable Spencer, and the last 2 boxes of ammunition he owned. There was a new intimacy in their shared purpose. Jed found himself spending more time in the Apache camp, learning. He watched the women treat animal hides with brain tannin until they were supple as cloth. He saw the way they wasted nothing, how every part of a hunted deer was used, from the sinew for thread to the bones for tools. It was a lesson in survival that made his own efforts seem clumsy and wasteful. He grew to respect Cale immensely. The warrior was stern and demanding, but fair. He drilled his men relentlessly, but he was the first to take on the hardest tasks. One blistering afternoon, Jed saw him sitting with Denali, patiently showing the boy how to fletch a small, toy arrow, his large, powerful hands moving with surprising gentleness. In that moment, Jed saw not just a war chief, but a father, an uncle, a protector of his people's future. The children, sensing the change in him, lost the last of their fear. Taza started following him on his rounds, asking questions with gestures about the cattle, the workings of the well pump, the strange metal tools in the barn. Jed found himself explaining things, his voice growing more accustomed to the act of speaking. Nalin continued to bring him gifts from the earth, bitter roots that, when brewed, eased the ache in his back, sweet berries that burst with flavor. Denali would now toddle up to the porch and simply sit, watching him work, the wooden horse always in his hand. One evening, a sickness fell over the youngest boy. Denali burned with fever, his small body racked with coughing. Cully and the other women worked over him with their traditional medicines, chanting low, hypnotic songs. But the fever would not break. Cale stood outside the teepee, his face a granite mask of helplessness. The formidable warrior who could face any enemy was powerless against the invisible foe attacking his nephew from within. Jed watched, his own gut twisting with the memory of another fever, another child. He remembered the uselessness of his own prayers. But then he remembered something else. His wife, Ellen, had been a woman of great knowledge when it came to herbs and remedies. He still had her small, leather-bound book filled with her neat handwriting, detailing the uses of various plants. He went to the chest and pulled it out. Flipping through the pages, his heart pounding, he found the entry he was looking for, mullein. For coughs and ailments of the lung, Ellen had written, grows in dry, disturbed soil, a tall stalk with yellow flowers and soft, woolly leaves. He knew the plant. He'd seen it growing down by the creek bed, had dismissed it as just another weed. He took the book and a lantern and went to Cale. He pointed to the drawing in the book, then to the creek. For the boy, he said. My wife, she used this. Cale looked at the book, at the strange symbols of the white man's writing, then at Jed's earnest face. He saw the pain and the hope warring there. He hesitated for only a second before giving a sharp nod. He called 2 of his warriors, and together they followed Jed into the darkness. They found the mullein plants, their silvery leaves ghostly in the lantern light. They gathered the leaves, and back at the camp, Jed showed Cully how to prepare them, crushing them to make a poultice for the boy's chest and steeping them in hot water for a tea. It was a profound moment of trust. Cully, the keeper of her people's ancient medicine, was allowing him, a white man, to treat her grandson with his own remedies. Jed sat with them through the night, a silent vigil outside the teepee. He listened to the boy's ragged breathing and Cully's soft chanting. the two sounds weaving together. Toward dawn, the coughing subsided. The fever broke. When Cully emerged from the teepee, her face was weary, but her eyes were filled with a deep, bottomless gratitude. She walked to Jed and placed her hand over his heart. No words were necessary. The bond was no longer about water or defense. It was forged in a shared fear for a child's life. When Cale came to him later that morning, the warrior looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. "Dagote," Cale said, his voice rough with emotion. He placed his fist over his own heart. Nalin, standing nearby, whispered the translation. "He says you are one of us." The words settled over Jed, not with weight, but with a sense of homecoming he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the loner. He was Dagote. He had a place. He had a people, and he would defend them. And this small piece of land that had become a sanctuary for them all, to his very last breath. The lookout Cale had posted on the high bluff sent the signal just after dawn 2 days later. A single puff of smoke quickly dispersed. Riders were coming. Them. The fragile peace was over. A quiet urgency fell over the ranch. It was not the chaos of panic, but the focused energy of a people who had lived with threat as a constant companion. The women gathered the children and led them to the most defensible part of the encampment, a shallow depression shielded by a thicket of mesquite. The warriors, their faces painted with stark, grim lines, took their positions, melting into the landscape Jed had once thought was empty. They moved with the silence of ghosts, their bows ready, their lances sharp. Jed stood on his porch, his old rifle in his hands. Cale stood beside him, holding his own rifle, a Winchester captured in some long-ago conflict. They were a strange pair, the weathered, solitary rancher and the implacable Apache war chief, united against a common foe. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They watched the horizon, waiting. The riders appeared as a dark smudge, growing steadily larger, resolving into a posse of at least 20 men. They were led by two figures Jed recognized instantly. At the front was Sheriff Brady, his tin star a dull glint on his chest, his face flushed and uncomfortable. Beside him, riding a fine black mare, was Silas Croft. Croft was dressed in a tailored suit, looking utterly out of place in the dust and grit, but his eyes, cold and predatory, were perfectly at home. He surveyed the scene, the cabin, the teepees, the lone figure of Jed on the porch, with a smug, proprietary air. The posse reined in just outside the fence line, a disorderly mix of nervous townsfolk Croft had deputized and hard-faced men who had the clear look of hired guns. "Jedediah Stone," Sheriff Brady called out, his voice trying for authority but cracking with nerves. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for harboring hostiles and endangering the good people of this county." Croft smiled, a thin, unpleasant slash in his face. "It's over, Stone," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You've had your little party. Now you'll step aside, and the sheriff will handle these squatters. Then you and I will have a talk about the sale of this property. I imagine the price will be considerably lower, given the circumstances." Jed's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He could feel Cale's stillness beside him, a dangerous, contained energy. He knew that one wrong move, one hostile word, could turn his ranch into a slaughterhouse. "There are no hostiles here, Sheriff," Jed called back, his voice steady. "These people are my guests. They're on my land, by my invitation." A murmur went through the posse. The idea was absurd to them. A white man inviting Apaches onto his land? He had to be either a madman or a traitor. "Don't be a fool, Stone," Croft sneered. "These are savages. They'll murder you in your sleep and burn your cabin to the ground. We're here to save you from your own stupidity. Now, step aside, where you'll be charged with obstructing justice as well." He gave a nod to Sheriff Brady. The sheriff, sweating profusely under his hat, cleared his throat. "You have to let us do our duty, Jed, for the good of everyone." Jed looked past them, at the faces of the men from town. He saw fear there, yes, but also a deep-seated hatred born of ignorance. He looked at Croft and saw nothing but greed. Then he thought of the people behind him. He thought of Cully's wisdom, of Taza's quiet strength, of Nalin's gentle kindness, of Denali's fever breaking in the pre-dawn quiet. He thought of the word Kale had given him, Dagote. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't win with bullets. His only weapon was the truth. He took a step forward, his rifle held loosely at his side. "You talk about savages, Croft," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a people who were starving and shared what little they had. I see a boy who stood guard over his brother and sister against a world that wanted them dead. I see a grandmother whose only wish is to keep her family safe." He paused, letting his words sink in. He saw a flicker of doubt on some of the townsmen's faces. They were ranchers and farmers, men who understood hardship. "My wife's boy, my son. He died of fever 6 years ago," Jed said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more raw. The confession cost him dearly, tearing open a wound he had kept sealed for years. A few nights ago, one of their children fell sick with that same fever. "I thought he would die, but these people, they fought for him. They used their medicines, and I used what I remembered of my wife's. And together, we saved him." He looked directly at Sheriff Brady. "You tell me, Sheriff, who are the savages here? The people who save a child's life, or the man who would use them as an excuse to steal a neighbor's land and water?" A dead silence fell over the plains. The accusation was plain, public, and undeniable. Croft's face, which had been smug, turned dark with fury. He had lost control of the narrative. Jed had turned it from a story about dangerous Indians into a story about a greedy man and a grieving father. "He's lying," Croft roared, his composure finally cracking. "He's been bewitched by them. They're murderers, all of them. I say we burn them out." He spurred his horse forward, drawing a silver-plated pistol from his coat. "If the law won't do it, I will." It was the moment everything had been leading to. But before Croft could raise his pistol, something happened. From the tepees, Cully emerged. She walked slowly, with a regal dignity, into the open space between the posse and the cabin. She was followed by the women of the tribe, and with them were all the children. They came not with weapons, but with their presence. They stood behind Cully, their faces unafraid, their dark eyes fixed on the armed men. Nalin and Taza were there, and beside them, holding Cully's hand, was little Denali, looking small and frail but very much alive, the wooden horse clutched in his fist. The sight of them, of the women and children standing defenseless but resolute, was more powerful than any armed warrior. It was a silent, damning indictment of Croft's bloodthirsty rage. The men in the posse looked from the children to the fuming Croft, and the certainty in their own cause began to crumble. They were here to fight hostile warriors, not to slaughter families. Sheriff Brady looked at the boy, Denali, and saw not an enemy, but a child. His face went pale. He had been led here by Croft's greed, and he was seconds away from presiding over a massacre. "Hold your fire," Brady yelled, his voice finally finding its authority. He rode his horse between Croft and the cabin. "That's enough, Silas. We're not firing on women and children. This is over. Get out of my way, you coward." Croft screamed, tried to push past him, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The men in the posse began to lower their rifles, their expressions a mixture of shame and relief. They had been stirred to a fever pitch by fear and prejudice, but the sight of a living child and the quiet courage of a lone man had broken the spell. Suddenly, from behind Jed, Kale and his warriors emerged from their positions. They did not raise their weapons. They simply stood there, a silent, unmovable wall of brown skin and hard muscle, flanking Jed and Cully. Their presence was a final, undeniable statement. This man is one of us. This is our ground. You will not pass. Croft looked at Jed, protected on all sides. He looked at the mutinous faces of his own posse, at the resolute stare of the sheriff, at the silent, watching Apaches. He was defeated, not by force of arms, but by a simple act of compassion that had blossomed into an unshakable community. With a curse that was choked with impotent rage, Silas Croft wheeled his horse around and galloped back towards Purgatory Gulch, a solitary figure of frustrated greed. The posse hesitated for a moment. Then, one by one, they turned and followed him, leaving in a cloud of dust and shame. Jedediah Stone stood on his porch, the rifle heavy in his hand, and watched them go. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, but for the first time in 6 years, it did not sound like a lament. It sounded like the quiet, contented sigh of peace. The battle was over. They had won. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It wasn't the tense, watchful silence of the days before, but a deep, peaceful calm. The threat had been met and turned away, not with violence, but with truth and unity. Croft's power, built on fear and intimidation, had been broken by the simple, undeniable humanity of the scene he had tried to destroy. The people from the posse did not return. Word of what had happened, of Jed's stand, of Cully's courage, of a living child refuting Croft's narrative of savagery, would spread through Purgatory Gulch. It would not erase generations of prejudice overnight, but it had planted a seed of doubt, a suggestion that the world was more complicated than simple stories of good versus evil, civilized versus savage. The people of the Blue Water stayed for another week. The time was different. The last vestiges of caution between Jed and the tribe dissolved completely. He was no longer the strange white man who owned the well. He was Dagote, their friend. He shared his meals with Cully and her family, sitting by their fire as the stars emerged, a brilliant canopy in the clear desert sky. He learned a few more words of their language, and they learned more of his. The communication was still halting, a patchwork of words and gestures, but the understanding was complete. Kel taught him how to read the tracks of animals in the dust, how to know the difference between a coyote and a wolf, a doe and a buck. Jed, in turn, showed the warrior how to repair the leather harness for his horse using his farrier's tools. They were two men from different worlds, but they found common ground in their shared skills and mutual respect. The children were a constant presence. Taza, his initial fierceness replaced by a sober curiosity, became Jed's shadow, helping with chores and absorbing every detail of the rancher's life. Nalin continued to bring him things: a strangely beautiful stone from the creek bed, a hawk's feather, a handful of sweet, wild plums. And Denali, fully recovered, would often climb onto the porch and simply fall asleep in a patch of sun, the wooden horse nestled under his chin, a picture of perfect trust. Jed felt a thawing inside him, a melting of the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The silence of his cabin was no longer filled with ghosts, but with the warm echoes of the day's interactions, the remembered sound of the children's laughter. He was healing, and he hadn't even realized how broken he was. But they all knew it couldn't last. The people were travelers, their lives tied to the seasons and the movement of the game. The ranch was a sanctuary, but it was not a permanent home. The morning they prepared to leave came without warning. Jed awoke to the sight of the women packing their belongings, of the men gathering the horse herd. There was no sadness in their preparations, only the quiet efficiency of a people accustomed to moving on. Cully came to him as he stood on his porch, watching the camp being dismantled. Taza, Nalin, and Denali were with her. "Our time here is done," she said, and Nalin translated, though Jed already understood. "The seasons change. We must go to the high country before the snows." Jed nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I know." Cully placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it carried the weight of all that had passed between them. "You're Dagote," she said. "You have a strong heart. You did not turn away from those in need. This land remembers. The people will remember." Kale approached, leading Jed's horse, its saddlebags filled with supplies, jerked venison, dried berries, and several water skins filled from the well. He handed the reins to Jed. It was a gift, a provision for the coming winter. "If the man Croft returns, send smoke," Kale said in rough English, pointing to the high bluff. "We will see it." It was not a promise to stay, but a promise to return if needed. It was more than Jed could have asked for. Finally, the children came to say their goodbyes. Taza stood before him, no longer a boy but a young man in the making. He bowed his head formally, a gesture of profound respect. Nalin, her eyes shining, pressed the hawk feather into his hand. And little Denali, the boy whose life had bound them all together, held out the small wooden horse. "No," Jed said, his voice thick. He knelt down, so he was eye to eye with the boy. "You keep it, to remember." Denali looked at the horse, then back at Jed. He nodded, clutching the toy tightly. Then he did something that broke the last of Jed's carefully constructed walls. He leaned forward and gave Jed a quick, shy hug. Jed's arms came up, holding the boy for just a second, the small, warm body a jolt to his soul. It was the first time he had held a child since his own son had died. He stood up, blinking back the moisture in his eyes, and watched them mount their horses. The entire tribe, a long, colorful procession, began to move out, heading east toward the mountains. They didn't look back. It was not their way. Jed stood on his porch and watched until the last rider had disappeared over the horizon, until the dust had settled and the land was once again empty and silent. The teepees were gone. The field was empty. The silence had returned. But it was a different silence now. It was not the hollow, aching silence of loneliness. It was a rich, resonant silence filled with memories. He looked at his hands. In one, he held a hawk feather, a gift. He turned and looked at his cabin, at the barn, at the well. It was still the same place, the same harsh and unforgiving land. But he was not the same man. He had shared a pot of beans with 3 orphans and, in doing so, had found a family. He had faced down a man's greed and, in doing so, had found his own courage. He was still a loner, but he was no longer alone. The land remembered, and so would he. He took a deep breath of the clean, cool air, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt like he was home. He stands on the porch as the sun sets, painting the mountains in fiery strokes of orange and gold. The field before him is empty, the grass already beginning to reclaim the circles where the teepees stood. The silence is profound, but it is the silence of peace, not desolation. In his hand, he turns over a smooth, gray stone, a gift from a little girl. He is a man who sought solitude to hide from his heart, only to find it again in the most unexpected way. He knows now that a life is not measured by what you own or what you've lost, but by the choices you make when compassion calls. He shared a simple meal, and in return, his empty life was filled to the brim. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts.